So good afternoon, and good afternoon. And as introduced, I'm Stephen Lance, Vice President of Solution Engineering here at Benefit Focus, and I have a clicker. Thank you. And I'm so encouraged and delighted to lead this panel discussion today on solving the ACA compliance puzzle, our game plan moving into 2020. I have a very diverse set of perspectives represented today on our panel, beginning with Jody Dietl. Jody is our Chief Compliance Officer at WageWorks. Slide. And in her 20 years of advocacy around employer-based health plans and consumer-driven health plans, she's not only led industry groups on the topic, but is also a stalwart on Capitol Hill, helping drive some practical perspectives into the conversation in Washington. So welcome, Jody, to the panel. To Jody's right, we have Kristen Lewis. Kristen Lewis is our Senior Director of Product Management for Equifax Workforce Solutions. And under Kristen's leadership, Equifax has brought to market an ACA compliance offer that really drives the principles of workforce analytics into the ACA compliance offering. So, Kristen, thank you for joining us today. To Kristen's right, we have Cindy Van Meer. Cindy Van Meer now leads our product marketing organization at Benefit Focus, and through her 11 years of tenure at Benefit Focus, she's had a variety of leadership roles in the product organization, and she is really our champion for our power user HR administrator and has had many roles in ACA compliance and bringing innovation to the HR power user. So welcome to the panel, Cindy. And to Cindy's right, we have Chris Condalucci. Chris runs the CC Law and Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and many of his endeavors include serving as the Tax and Benefits Counsel to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, which actually drafted much of the ACA legislation that we have today. So as we settle in, I'd like to begin, Jody, discussing with you maybe a little bit of a retrospective on where we've been from 2010 now into 2016, looking at progress, challenges, and lessons learned from the past few years. When we think about employer ACA legislation, there's really two broad categories that we're navigating today. There is that book of regulation that drive access, quality, affordability, and then there's the other stack of regulations that drive support for compliance and really our accountability to get to that intended outcome. So underlying all of the ACA regulation is this key principle that the regulation will push an evolution of the employer-based healthcare plan design. Okay? And one of the key levers is that 60% underwriting value or actuarial value that's a key lever in pushing employers that direction. And for those that are on the prospective side of that, think it's a real catalyst for consumerization. Those that are maybe on the detractor side think that it's maybe causing kind of a race to the bottom of the value of the employer-based health plan. What's really happening out there, and are the intended consequences of the ACA really manifesting?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. The ACA has created just an enormous opportunity for us as well as an enormous challenge, right? It's the perfect storm, really, for all of us. And I would agree with you. I think there's a race to the bronze era. We call it, on the Hill, we call it the bronze era, ushering in, particularly because of some of the minimum value, the affordability challenges, just the competitive nature in the economy. There was a drive towards that. I think the looming challenge for us all now is the Cadillac tax. And I think many people don't understand that the Cadillac tax is a very, very complicated calculation as it stands today. Both, it includes all of the coverage costs that you saw on the previous slide, and yes, there is a sigh of relief, but many people don't understand that the FSA contribution by the employee and the HSA contribution by the employee count. So I think there's many more employers at risk than they first thought. So, there's been a lot of opportunity for conversation on the Hill, like, did you realize that this is in, the law? You'll remember probably the line that Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker, probably regrets saying for the rest of her life. We have to pass it to read it, right, to find out what's in it. And I think that's been a real eye-opener for many in Congress. So,
Yeah.
but employers are racing towards consumer-driven healthcare for a variety of reasons, not only ACA, but to Minnie's point, we have to be competitive in this nation, and we have to build the bottom line, and we do need to engage the consumer. So I think that's what's driving it.
But there's such a dichotomy, a huge concern from the employers to keep that cost sustainable, but there's also some silver linings in there for employees as well. When we really talk about access, one of the key selling points and provisions around the minimum essential benefit was an employee's ability to access wellness checkups within that minimal essential benefits packages without paying a deductible. And so we also see employees managing costs, but they're also pushing employees to take advantage of the benefits that are afforded to them. Do we see any barriers or any ways employers are really using to push that communication around the benefits to their employees?
You know, I think that is the challenge on both the public exchange and the private exchanges, as well as the employer plans. Remember that preventative care without cost sharing has always been a hallmark of the high deductible plan as well. And it's hard to get employees to take advantage of it because we don't really look at our benefit structure until we are sick, right? And so I think there's a lot of opportunities still to communicate these opportunities for the preventative services that are now mandated to be covered without cost sharing.
Yeah. So there's a lot of compelling clauses within the legislation that were intended to push innovation on the wellness front, right? From participatory wellness programs to results-based wellness programs in the context of the ACA and EEOC. So what innovations, maybe Cindy, you could speak to this, what innovations do we really see employers bringing to bear relative to taking advantage of that great leeway that the ACA affords in wellness programs?
It's funny, we were having a conversation yesterday at the Sponsor Expo about telehealth and telemedicine and how that's gaining a lot of momentum and popularity because it really helps with affordability and employees that, it's an extra benefit versus having to pay for those doctor visits towards their high deductible. And even as cutting edge as that was maybe a year ago, now we see people incorporating those into their benefit programs. And so there's this other set of really interesting benefits that are even more bleeding edge. A couple of people that are really working on how to get outcome-based wellness programs built in a way that's very engaging with the employers. So a couple of folks on that front would be Zipongo, Red Brick Health. They really designed these programs to talk to people the way that they expect to receive their information in their phone, really pushing and driving them to participate so that the wellness incentives are designed to make sure that they're not discriminatory and that people have an opportunity to participate in them and really achieve results. And so really that's where the incentive comes based on results. And so less of that traditional just go get a biometric screening or just quit smoking because, by nature, and even when you see the workforce and the younger workforce coming in, many people are much more health conscious now than they ever were before.
Just to add a second, with respect to compliance, of course, and especially with respect to wellness, just sadly, HIPAA was in the law, enacted in 1996, and there's been regulations that have been written since that makes it that much more difficult to, implement and offer or let's say maximize a wellness program. And it's those compliance legal hoops that the employers have to jump through, which to an extent, one would argue the employer can't maximize the wellness program or to get out of that wellness program what they're trying to get out of it. But with the ever-increasing costs of healthcare, with the advent of the ACA, more employers are looking to wellness as a way to better manage their costs. And if the employer decides that, saying, okay, look, costs are going up, compliance is difficult with regard to the ACA, let's implement a wellness program, one thing that folks, I think, know or should know at this point that there are a lot of hoops that one has to jump through in order to get out of that wellness program what you really want. And that's certainly a compliance point that is important to make, notwithstanding the fact that you have folks setting up wellness program incentive-based but also we have the penalty-based type of wellness program that is, which I think more and more employers, and I'd love to hear what others' experiences on this, are finding is more effective from getting their employees to either take a particular health risk assessment or participate in a particular program, because non-participation is greeted with a penalty, and that is actually now permissible because there are regulations that the EOC has recently issued, but there is a lot of give and take when it comes to compliance that folks have to, I think, keep in mind.
Well, I think what's interesting is it's a lot easier to track and see the effectiveness of the program when there's a penalty versus when there's an incentive. So if people are participating or taking advantage, just the way the programs are structured or where the data lies, it's really hard to capture all the analytics that you need to see if the program has been effective and kind of measure if you're accomplishing what you need to accomplish. But I would agree that penalty-based are probably more popular and that you see them a lot more.
And in those compliance weeds of every good intention, right?
That's right.
There was also another series of what I observe are some of the more onerous provisions to comply with relative to the ACA. And those are the variable hour employee eligibility tracking and the corresponding 1094, 1095 employer share responsibility reporting. Lots of words and lots of actions, right? So, Kristen, when we started on this journey in 2010 and we really started to understand the implications of variable hour employee eligibility, there was a great concern voiced in the market relative to the financial impact it could possibly have on associates that are on part-time schedules. How, on balance, have we seen that concern really play out in the market?
You know, it's interesting, and it's fun is an odd word to use, but we're going into this year for the first time with actually a year of data to look back on. And employers were going into 2015 so blind about what the decisions that they made about how they were going to measure their workforce and what were their decisions about affordability. And the best you could do is guess and make some predictions about how things would pan out. So I think a lot of the intrigue that we heard around, employers are going to cut hours or wages are going to change as a result of this. The fact is we haven't really seen that in our data. Equifax has access to the biggest database of payroll records in the U.S., and we've seen that the industry as a whole, 60% of the U.S. workforce is paid hourly. When you look kind of across the boards, about 60% of those hourly workers are averaging 30 hours or more per week. And it hasn't really changed. There's some industries that are actually going up in hours, healthcare being one of them. And then others like retail or restaurants where that hourly population was already averaging less than 30 hours per week, and that trend has continued. So I think a lot of the companies that we worked with, they really were coming to us and asking, what's everyone else doing? But hours worked is a benefit that a lot of hourly workers are looking to their employer to provide. So we saw a lot of hesitation from employers of, we don't want to cut hours, we're not sure what impact that would have on turnover and other things unrelated to ACA. So I think there was some conservative, hesitation this year that, has kind of prevented the anticipated dip in hours worked.
In the pre-panel discussion, we had a conversation about this, and I think that one of the challenges that all employers are facing is they don't want to be first. So as many in the audience know,
But they'll be the second.
there's already a case with Dave & Buster's who sadly held an all-employee meeting telling them that they were going to reduce hours to pay for ACA and to deal with it. And so I think there still are many of those outcomes that are out there that employers want to consider, but they don't want to be first, they don't want to be challenged. And I think there's still a period of, there's a lot of regulations that still need to come out on ACA. And that's the thing that I think gives us, maybe fun is the right word, right? It's a very exciting time. I call it the Chief Compliance Officer's Job Stability Act, right? Full Employment Act, because every regulation that comes out affects WageWorks business, it affects the employers as a whole. And as we serve our 59,000 employers, you're in a position to help guide them through this maze. And in many cases, it's, you need to wait because this guidance isn't out yet. This is what it looks like today, but lots could change, right?
Absolutely. And I think, more and more we're seeing a trend around employers are caring a lot about employee engagement, about communicating with their employees about ACA. Whereas last year it was all about let's get the data in, let's see how this is all going to pan out. Later in the year, and especially right now, it's all about communicating with your employees around they're getting these new tax forms. What does that mean? There's these penalties they may be facing. What role does the employer play? So I think it gives you almost a different lens to evaluate decisions about look-back measurements and how do you determine who you're going to make your plans available to.
It's kind of related to your initial question about race to the bottom and opportunities and what employers are doing. The way that I tend to look at it, and folks may have heard others refer to it this way. I mean, you have a ceiling for all intents and purposes with the Cadillac tax, and you have a floor for all intents and purposes with the employer mandate and the affordable minimum value plan. I mean, as Stephen indicated earlier, I was on the Senate Finance Committee during the development of portions of the ACA, and the employer mandate was one of those provisions that I participated in, as well as the Cadillac tax. Now, in truth, we didn't look at it as a floor and a ceiling. But what we did say is, for purposes of employer coverage, similar to the individual market and the small group market, that folks that are offering coverage, employers specifically, needed to offer a minimum level of coverage. And that's where you have the affordable minimum value plan rules, which is again on the floor. So from a planning perspective, I don't think, at least in my experience, and Jody, I think you spoke to this, that we haven't seen a race to the bottom, but at the same time, there was a specified floor that the employers now knew that they could, let's say, plan around and develop plan designs. And actually, with going back to my ceiling, there obviously are limitations with what, let's say, comprehensive benefits, cost of coverage, different types of coverage that you offer, which need to be aggregated due to the Cadillac tax in the manner that Jody described. So you have another kind of set of plan design strategies that an employer can take on. And within that, employers are trying to figure out, okay, we have an ever-increasing cost of healthcare. How do I best manage that? Then you pull in the wellness programs in order to deal. So the conclusion, sorry for continuing to ramble, but there is no race to the bottom, but at least there was a specified floor that you could plan to. Then you see the Cadillac tax, you go, oh no, I can't offer comprehensive benefits and I've got to manage my costs overall. And how do I manage my costs just generally? Because cost is really the driver and the things that the employers are worried about the most. And at the same time, you've got to keep your employees happy and you have to have engagement, as Cindy described.
Well, I would say that cost is an important factor, but more and more, most of the leading employers really are legitimately concerned about the health of their workforce. And so you'll see top and most competitive employers who hire the best and the brightest, they're also in a position where they have to put together a package between the floor and the ceiling that's very compelling to bring the best, to hire the best. And so they're having to get real creative about how they put those plans together while remaining compliant and driving down costs, and then but still serving their workforce and just making wellness and healthcare part of the culture versus a cost driver, right? Because now that employers have to brand their benefits, no one wants to be known for, just looking at it just on the cost base, and even though that's
And that's one thing that's been so compelling for me, being exposed to the keynote this morning, and this might be a shameless plug. I haven't been exposed to kind of the nuts and bolts and under the hood, but the most exciting thing to me about benefit focus is it gives employers opportunities to kind of model these techniques. So, your data scientist, I want to meet her.
Jen,
I want to
we'll
meet
make
her
that happen
afterwards
for you.
Because, for example, the Cadillac tax, you can't look at it based on average cost of benefits in your organization. You need to look at it by state. So some of your very large employers, if you have employees in California and Connecticut, you might be hosed already. You need to model the FSA and HSA contributions into it. And this is an incredible opportunity or tool set that employers and clients that have benefit focus can, I think, use to their advantage to make that planning technique a lot better. And you're right, it is going to become all about attracting and retaining employees and engaging them in their consumerism through, you're absolutely right, one of the tenets of the Affordable Care Act was to improve the health status of individuals. And until we do that, there's going to be nothing affordable,
Yeah.
or we're really not going to change it.
And I'm not going to do it unless it's meaningful to me,
Right.
right? And
Right.
it's what I want.
Absolutely.
And so it would be impossible for one benefit admin or one small group of people to figure out what that is for every single person. One size doesn't fit all, right? So that's the challenge.
Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge, but when you start to apply data to a business problem, it brings me back to another compliance topic, which is very data intensive, and that is our 1094 and 1095C reporting obligations. So as we looked and partnered with our customer base and worked with the industry through this for our first reporting year in 15, we found two very common challenges. The first common challenge was we have to go back, we being employers in general, may have to go back and create data that didn't exist before, back to January 1st. And the other challenge that we observed was that data may exist, but it's in very disparate places, and it's not organized in a way that can be reported. So maybe, Kristen, you could likely field this. Are those challenges unique to year one, or are those challenges likely to persist over time?
I wish I could tell everybody I think they're all totally unique to year one. We're going to be completely out of the woods, but benefits data has never, ever had to be reported in the level of detail that it is now. This is the first ever tax form that has been in a landscape view. There's so much information on this form, and we can't even report it normally. We're translating it into these indicator codes. So for those of you who were able to successfully, get data in and figure out what it means, then you have to figure out, well, what do these codes mean, and how do I explain that to my employees? So I do think for sure, if you worked to get those forms out the door this year, you've built the foundation. It becomes a matter of maintenance now. You're not going to have to rebuild the house every year. But what we found, and we support at Equifax about 850 employers, and they represent about, now it's up to 18 million employees, many of whom are receiving these 1095s for the first year. A lot of employers waited until they got all the data in and then really didn't know what to look for, right? How do you know if you have data issues? How do you know what to focus on to make sure those forms are right? Part of our solution is to really surface, here's the forms that represent a compliance risk. And what we would find is for a lot of employers, that would be a smaller percentage, and they don't even want to look at the ones that don't. They're like, get those out the door, send them to the employees. Now let me figure out what happened with these other ones. But sometimes it really takes going through on an employee by employee basis to figure out what happened here. A lot of you on the stage, especially you, Cindy,
Yes.
would know, benefits are a really confusing thing for employees. So we see all the time that somebody, made a decision to enroll and then made a decision not to join the company. So we have this enrolled employee who isn't actually an employee, so there's things like that are going to continue to happen, and it's requiring employers to put a lot of policies and new business rules in place to figure out what are these types of situations and how do we prevent ourselves from reporting some information to the IRS or to employees that would potentially be definitely incorrect, but also very confusing.
And then add to that the complexity of former employees and retired employees and
Absolutely.
employees on leave and employees on disability.
Mergers, acquisitions.
Right, all of those issues, create the opportunity for solutions, right?
Chris?
And I can't speak to the question relating to data. Kristen's the expert in that regard. But from a compliance perspective, yeah, there are certain aspects of the employer reporting rules that you can learn and understand, and they're going to be set going forward. The deadlines are really one example of that, notwithstanding the fact that December 28th, the IRS came out and extended those deadlines, surprisingly, much to everyone's surprise but delight.
Elation, yeah.
But next year, we're back to the normal January 31st for the 1095C. If you're filing electronically, which most larger employers are, that's again on March 31st. So those are easy compliance deadlines that aren't going to change. And once you know it, you know it. But here's some things that are going to change. And it just really goes back to, the ongoing guidance that continues to come out by IRS. There's either questions that pop up that the regulators failed to address when they initially wrote the regulations. Questions pop up just as business practice changes. Two examples of that is counting contributions for purposes of reporting as well as the employer mandate affordability test. One is the cash in lieu of benefits. issue. Many plans out there offer an opt-out credit or a cash in lieu of benefits. And IRS, in December 16th, again, at the end of the year, actually issued guidance clarifying how an employer should count those contributions for affordability purposes, as well as reporting on line 15 of the 1095C. And also they came out and said, here is how you should count flex credits that are run through 125 plan that are used for major medical, but also for supplemental products, ancillary products, and HSA contribution. So there are rules that employers are always going to have to continue to be up to speed on as it relates to the reporting, notwithstanding the fact that there are going to be some rules, you know, that you don't have to worry about. You can just set it and let it go.
Right, and then I guess that's maybe you could look at that in a positive light and say if there's something you really, really hate about the Affordable Care Act, just wait 5 minutes and it very likely could change. We were working with a lot of employers who had unions and were dealing with multi-employer plans. COBRA transactions were hard to get a hold of, and then in September, all of the rules surrounding that changed, and there's this half relief and then half just frustration that you had worked so hard to get it right. So I always say, you know, when we look at our really successful customers with ACA, I think one of the most important qualities to have is a sense of humor, because it is what it is. It's going to continue to change. It's really important to have a plan and to plan in advance and start early, but just know that despite your best efforts, you're exactly right. The regulations will continue to evolve, and the organizations and vendors will have to as well.
So we've seen a bit of a pattern emerge, right, when difficult regulations begin to progress in time towards what we thought was a deadline. To one of two things happen. The deadline get pushed, and that's happened on 2 occasions, or there's a sense of a little bit of leniency and forgiveness in the words that the IRS uses when they explain the new deadline. Do you see this as a hopeful pattern or a realization that some practicality in the business situation is being heard on the Hill? Maybe Chris, Cindy?
I definitely think that the regulators do believe that the ACA is so complicated, and many of the provisions that were enacted, that the regulators now have to write regulations for that. They would like to get those regulations out just to show folks how crazy complicated complying with these crazy rules are. So that said, the reason I believe you're seeing many of these extensions is for that reason. The regulators are unable to, in my opinion, in my experience, get the rules in a way that actually work. So it's almost square peg round hole situation. Having said that, though, we're now, let's say, however far past 2014 when a lot of the ACA rules were supposed to be effective, setting aside the Cadillac tax for a moment, of course, and they've delayed them already, i.e. the employer mandate, the employer reporting. We just had the deadline extension. So there's almost, you know, you can't continue to do these things, or you're almost not let's say, operating good government, or operating in a fashion that we as, you know, how do I want to say it? I don't want to say Americans, but just individuals who want government to operate. If the rules are there, they should be implemented and folks should comply. But if the rules are so complicated and you can't even write those rules, then you have problems. And again, I think that's where we've seen the extensions. But the bottom line point is I don't see further extensions coming down the line, because folks have had such a long time and there's been such a long span between 14 and now for folks to at least try to wrap their arms around some of those rules.
And let's bring up the concept of community, because I think you have to realize that the regulators, they oftentimes, most of the time, do not have any practical experience. And they really want you to come in and help them understand how difficult it is. And so one of my chief responsibilities is advocacy. And sometimes that means explaining to a millennial staffer on the Hill what an FSA is and what an HSA is, and the complexities between high deductible health plans and whatever it is. And sometimes it's taking data into the agencies and saying, in fact, I had the opportunity to go into the White House and meet with the senior economic policy advisors, and there were these 2 gentlemen and a woman sitting across from me, and I walked them through the Cadillac tax calculation for a fictitious company. And they, have poker faces. They're really good at that, but they were taking copious notes, and by the end of the conversation, there was sweat on their brow, and they were ashen. I think they had no idea how complicated it is. And so, you know, we need voices, we need people, and there's lots of opportunities for that through industry organizations, through your community here, through advocacy websites, I can tell you about that, and other, you know, many people are involved. You went up on the Hill with the American Benefits Council, we're also a member, and it really, I loved it because you actually said to me, we walked out of the meeting and I thought, well, that was a waste of time. And
a tail between the legs was like, we failed. They just shut us down. And we were there advocating for the delay of the reporting deadlines because employers were in such a panic. But they will, till the bitter end, they will tell you, absolutely not. And like I mean, the Treasury Department was very, very firm around, we all almost lost our jobs when we delayed it the first time. There is no scenario in which it will get delayed again. We understand your concerns. It is not happening. So I get on a webinar the next week and I'm like, sorry, everyone. We tried. It's not going to get delayed again. And then a month later, it did get delayed again.
Everybody had a great New Year's Eve party.
It's like, what? Did someone go in after us?
And then you feel completely the opposite. You're like, man, I rock.
Right.
Right? So
I think
it's worth it. It's worth going
It really
there.
represents an interesting dichotomy of the conversations that we observe. We observe conversations that are really practical and action-oriented when we're discussing with our employers, but on the Hill, we observe that there's a different set of priorities being discussed. So, Chris, can you really talk about what those priorities on the Hill that are being discussed today, less the political rancor that we observe, that are really material to what's going to guide our thoughts around compliance moving forward?
One, I think it depends who you're talking to, of course, but I think everyone would agree that, you know, less complexity is a good thing. So if you're a staffer, and again, I was on Senate Finance, and I tried to adhere to this when folks like Jody and others would come in and talk to me is, so if we're starting with, we want less complexity, how do we get there? And then sadly, as you kind of put 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 together, then 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kind of fall into the big bucket of what you're trying to do, which then just, again, adds more complexity. So that's almost a long way of saying that I think we're all in trouble when it comes to trying to simplify things because, again, as you try to simplify or take out the complexity, it continues to creep back in. You know, what can you do going forward? I mean, the reporting is actually a great example. So we obviously know how complicated those rules are. There's actually legislation that would it attempts to simplify the reporting. I don't foresee that legislation going anywhere, but staffers do start with that question of how do we simplify, how do we reduce the complexity, and that's an example. But there are a lot of other political forces at play which don't allow, let's say, the right thing to be done, and we're back in the soup, right? So it's really not an answer on how do you solve this problem. It's almost just a reality. But I think most on Capitol Hill, from the member level, from the members of Congress and the Senate, from the House of Representatives and the senators, do get when an employer comes up or a company like Equifax or WageWorks or Benefit Focus comes up and says, wow, this stuff is just really complicated. It really doesn't work. A member of Congress gets that. So does staff, and that's why you've seen Congress actually enact these delays. We've seen a 2-year delay of the Cadillac tax, 2-year delay in other aspects of the ACA. So you can't forget what Congress can do, but it really is, I don't have a good answer. I sadly don't.
I think it's important to, you have to learn the vernacular and learn, you know, as Chris said, sadly the politics right now in this country are pretty polarized. So when you go up to talk about an ACA issue, you know, particularly why are FSA and HSA contributions included in the Cadillac tax? You have to be really creative about that because nobody wants to do anything for ACA because the Republicans don't want to be seen as helping it and the Democrats don't want to be seen as admitting that there's a problem, right?
And all of us are stuck in the middle.
Right, and so you're stuck in the middle, so then you have to find a different way to talk about it. And that's where the data analytics come in because I know that WageWorks, for example, looked at our 4.8 million consumers who have these accounts, and we found startling income data. We were able to append household data and found that the average household income of an FSA holder was 56,080, and an HSA person was 56,880 or something like that. So right around the middle class. And the argument then becomes, look, you grant subsidies on the individual exchange to families of 4 with household incomes of up to $105,000. Why are you going to hurt these families that are middle class, clearly middle class? In fact, 90% of our participants have household, or 88% of them have household incomes of $90,000 or less, something close to that. And that's where the compelling story is, because now you're talking about protecting consumers, you're talking about we've had economic stagnation, you really want to help these people out. You guys are concerned about people with this deductible gap that Benefit Focus so carefully and well done highlighted this risk corridor that individuals have. If you talk about it from those standpoints, you start to get their attention and movement, and that's what helped contribute to the 2-year Cadillac tax delay. And the Hatch bill right now has a carve out for those, and next week there will be another bill introduced, Lord willing, by Senator Thune.
Because Stephen, your question, I mean, really, here's a perfect illustration. Jody just spoke to, so the Cadillac tax, the way it works, or one of the aspects of the way it works, is you have to count employee FSA and employee HSA contributions that are run through a cafeteria plan toward the Cadillac tax. Now, most employees would agree, we personally, as employees, but also your employees, would agree that that's their money, that it should not be counted toward the Cadillac tax. But as I like to refer to it, there's a legal fiction that the IRS created back in the 80s that actually count these employee contributions as employer contributions, and as a result of these being employer contributions, they're counted toward the tax. So when we go up to Capitol Hill and we explain this legal fiction and the fact that it's really employee money and therefore shouldn't be counted toward the Cadillac tax, but yes it is, staffers get it. Members of Congress get it. And so if you want to maybe get something done, you can get that consensus around some logic, even cutting through the legal fiction or some of the complexity, but then sadly you run smack into the politics, which we all despise. But at least that's an illustration where people do get it. We could see it actually happen. There is legislation that will be introduced. And that's kind of how the process works for right or wrong. And it just remains to be seen, how people go forward with
So the key theme I'm hearing is advocate for tomorrow, but plan for today.
Exactly right.
Well said.
That's exactly right.
So when we kind of draw that line back from tomorrow back into today, Chris, when you describe for us the top being the Cadillac tax and the bottom being the bronze plan, I heard, well, we're really in the mighty middle. And that mighty middle is being increasingly defined by the high deductible health plan. And as we saw in the previous session, there is that gap of exposure. So that draws me to the question is, what are some best practices, some creative ways that employers can really manage the today and that exposure and compel their employees to make smart, sound financial decisions to manage the gap that we find ourselves settling in the industry?
Well, to some extent, I think it's figuring out better ways to communicate plan design. Your own research in the session before told us that there wasn't very much difference in deductibles between a traditional PPO plan and the high deductible health plan. And by the way, who named that? Who wants to sign up for the crappy plan, right? In fact, the Hatch bill would rename the high deductible health plan to the HSA eligible plan. Would that not make sense? That's another point you could advocate for. It doesn't cost anything, and it would make the communication so much better. So the first thing is, I would advocate for a plan design of sort of a richer high deductible plan with the minimum deductibles and out-of-pocket costs, and then then people really know what they have to plan for, what their risk corridor is, right? It's a $1,300 deductible, and my maximum exposure is whatever it is, 6,000 something. And then you help them. And then maybe there's one that's stepped down more for the millennials that say, or the invincibles that say, I don't really need it, right? Because I'm really healthy, and until I break my leg skiing this week, I'm going to be fine, right? And so I think that simplifying the design more, making the financial decision very apparent. So if I have my choice between a $1,300 and a $2,000 deductible, and everything else is equal, there better be a $700 premium difference, right? And helping people do that math, make it an educational decision or a financial decision more than an emotional decision, right, is going to be much more effective in then helping with the consumer-directed healthcare, the benefit accounts, because that's really the key for the employee to take control, the participant to take control and become engaged in the process.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's all about how you position your product, your benefits, how you promote them, how you brand them. You know, if you think about, if you like the name HSA eligible plan, you can do that today, right? If you're
If you like your plan, you can keep your plan.
If you're a self-insured employer, you can name it. And so you can try different things to position the plan. And I think what's different too is you know, maybe 10 years ago, you were just trying to teach people the difference between a PPO and HDHP. Now you're trying to teach them how to use the HDHP. And so I think that makes all the difference is, you know, it's really, the first time I went on a high deductible health plan, I was really scared to take the leap, right? But once I figured out I could do stuff like call different types of x-ray labs and compare costs and figure out where I was getting the most bang for my buck, then it was kind of like a game, right? Because who doesn't want a deal, right? So I think if you start to think about it that way, alleviate the complexity. I know that as benefit administrators, there's a high necessity to make sure employees understand information about the plan and compliance, but if you can make it simple in the way that you communicate to them and I hate to use the word gamify, but empower them to understand just how much of a consumer role they can have when they're selecting their plan. I think that really helps to drive them towards the plan that's their best fit for them. At Benefit Focus, we like to think about an employee's plan fit, and so employers have this interest where they want to take care of their employees. They want to make sure that they're satisfied and that they can drive down costs, and employees really just need plans that fit their individual personal situation. And so being able to provide the information that's needed so people know which plan fits them the best will therefore lead to better decisions about which plans to select and how to manage their care, and then ultimately better lives, as we like to say at Benefit Focus.
I think what really struck me about that response is the majority of the tools that you referenced were really extending the administration of that problem beyond the bounds of the medical plan. You mentioned price transparency, you mentioned wellness, you mentioned incentives. So I think we're seeing, in general, the HR administrators and benefit specialists defining the solution outside the context of the original problem, which is the medical plan structure. So what are you seeing some best practices coming about in doing that?
Yeah, I think one thing that we see is getting more creative with the benefit plan. So because you're trying to drive down costs, you maybe not can spend so much on the medical, but you can help employees meet their needs in other ways. So voluntary benefits, for example, helping them manage the gap, and just more modern types of design. There's also a lot of very disruptive new healthcare providers in the market also thinking about how they can structure new products to sell employers that meet this need.
Well, I'm sorry, we'd be remiss if we didn't, though, say do that in a very compliant way, because there's a lot of new creative things that could trip you up. Remember that if you're in an HSA eligible plan, but you have other impermissible coverage, you can't be in the HSA. So when you're being creative with all of these ancillary benefits or other things, you just need to make sure that you check off all of the compliance boxes too, and that's why it's a job security act.
The rules are such a buzzkill.
It is. Well, it's funny, I'm sitting right in the middle of you two, because I think both there's this huge need to educate your employees about the plans that you have available. And then when you think about the compliance piece, so you have to think outside of the box of your own plans too, especially for those that are in verticals like retail, restaurants. You mentioned the average income being $50,000. Most people in America qualify for subsidized coverage through the marketplace. So when they're answering the question on that application of, did your employer offer you affordable coverage, they're comparing that to the subsidized premium that they saw they would have access to through the marketplace, and their answer is no. They didn't offer me affordable coverage, and they're going in that direction. So helping your employees understand not only, the great plans that you may have to offer, but, there are implications of you offering them affordable minimum value coverage that makes them ineligible for the coverage to the marketplace. And if they don't realize that, it can create some really challenging interactions for them down the road when they may have to repay that subsidy later. So couldn't agree more with the importance of
Proceed with
education.
caution.
But yeah, and just think about that as part of your education. You know, there's the mandated notification you have to provide about the exchanges, but we all should have gotten it. I'm sure none of us read it. It's not a great way to help your employees understand the difference.
Remember that the Affordable Care Act used to be called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and the acronym was PPACA. Some of us called it PPCACA, right? And so then it became
Now we all will.
It was the Affordable Care Act. But you know, when we were lobbying back in 2009, 2010. We were advocating, because many of you don't realize that FSAs, for example, were to be eliminated as part of a pay-for affordable care. I mean, so there was some very real concern on the part of employers who about that risk corridor and using the FSA. So when we went in and advocated for that position and advocated successfully for it, you know, we used to say we are the Affordable Care Act. The high deductible health plan, the consumer-driven engagement, we're the best thing going. You don't want to hurt that, right? So
I was going to say, look, you know, employers always needed to undertake strategic planning when it comes to their benefit and their benefit designs. And the Cadillac tax, for all intents and purposes, really accelerated what employers already needed to do. And I know you've probably heard that before, but that, to me, is just the bottom line. So really, you almost have to come up with plan designs, and you have to be creative, and you have to figure out how to fill in the gaps with these various coverages. And I do think that, you know, and you've heard this too, I'm sure, you hear this and you're like, what? I'm frustrated to continue to hear this, but the ACA did provide an opportunity to pound into your employees, into their heads, that they should and could and can take advantage of these various ancillary products to fill in the gaps, because you as the employer, either you could blame it on the ACA and the Cadillac tax, or you as the employer could just own up and say, look, costs of healthcare are just going up, and so we are shifting to a more consumer-driven health type of arrangement, and I am going to help you help yourself, and that goes to the education, but I think you have to have the coverages that fill in those gaps, regardless of whether the ACA is there, the employers needed to do it anyway, and I think it really gives the opportunity to leverage technology that is now available that really was never around before. So I guess that's my soapbox.
I think that really brings me back to one of the core questions. Is there true business value in compliance done well?
True business
I would say,
value.
yeah, absolutely.
Other than cost avoidance.
Well, you know, I think, first of all, I think you want to be a responsible employer, and you want to do the right thing. I mean, that's socially and morally and ethical kind of a baseline humanity. You also don't want to be the Dave and Buster or the Anthem breach or the, you know, any of those things that any large employer who's concerned about their brand, you know, wants to take on. So I think that, you know, and I think it also makes good business sense because you can communicate. I think it's every business's core value that we want to do the right thing by our customers, right? Well, you have to set the standard by leading from the top.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest also, or proves that as employers who take care of their employees, who don't have to stress about care or about being sick or about how they're going to pay for those expenses, leads to a happier worker, right? Who in turn gives better service to the people they're serving, who are the customers of that large employer. And so I really like the heart part of HR and benefits, and there's a lot of business value in being compliant and teaching people how they can help their workforce just take advantage of these opportunities and take advantage of these free preventative care visits that weren't available before.
And related to that, I mean, back to your compliance, I mean, of course, yes, you can have the right business sense and get the right compliance people, either hire people in-house, you look for the right people outside that can help you with compliance matters. But honestly, and again, maybe this is preachy and I don't intend it to, but there's an opportunity for the HR managers and the plan administrators to become experts themselves. Like, it is so I'm an employee benefit attorney by training, so I do legal work in addition to some policy work. And I read regulations all the time, and I advise clients, I advise insurance carriers, I advise folks that participate in the exchanges and whatnot. So it is not any fun to really roll up your sleeves and dig into the regulations. It stinks. But you know what? I think I'm better at what I do because of that. And I think folks in your position, or even folks up here, you can take advantage of that opportunity to be that expert. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but at the same time, you can be the smartest person in the room because you know what the rules are. And I think from a business perspective, that makes your company that much better and you that much better.
And then every time you see your friends and families, they ask you to help them sign up for their insurance plan.
Lucky you.
And now everybody understands what I do for a living at my house.
So as we enter the last 10 minutes of our conversation, I'd just like to rely on each of your respective areas of expertise. And maybe, Kristen, I'll start with you, and then we'll go through to Jody and on down the line. So we've had 2 years of real practical experience, right, in compliance and identifying the HR policies that are going to drive some of the compliance. For example, we have had 2 years of looking at results relative to how we set our measurement periods and how we set our eligibility periods. And do you see those decisions being revisited as we move towards 2020, or do some of those core tenets of how we administer our compliance programs solid and we're in operation mode now?
That's a great question, and I think a lot of it really does go back to what I said at the beginning around you finally have a year of history to look back on. A lot of the results were surprising. I was telling some of you backstage, you know, of the 18 million employees that we were managing in our system this year, about 6.3 million that were actually measured in a look back and completed the look back. A huge number don't even stay 12 months before they come out of it. Of that 6.3 million that finished a measurement, only 259,000 actually were measured full time. So I actually turned out having to be required to be offered benefits. So I think a lot of employers were sort of shocked at, wow, we thought this was going to be this unbelievably large impact on our business. It didn't, for a lot of companies, have a really material impact on that population that became eligible. So we're definitely encouraging customers to start to look a little bit beyond just that rule set of who are you mandated to offer coverage to, and maybe look at the broader metrics around turnover, employee engagement. You know, you were talking about the employees who accept the benefits, you know, they are more engaged, they may offer better service. So thinking about, now that you have this year of data and now that you've got a little bit of context about how your employees are going to respond to an offer of coverage, or are they going to make it through a look back, it might be a really good time to sort of think about how to set up that compliance part of your strategy as part of your overall benefit strategy.
Yeah. Jody?
I think there will continue to be regulations and all that, but I think the points that have been made, and really going back to the earlier session about the data, you have an incredible opportunity to revisit your strategy in a much more comprehensive way. Adding to those analytics, what are current HSA balances, not just looking at the contribution this year, but are employees closing that risk corridor over time? How can I get them to? How can I incent them to be more engaged? If my workforce is turning more towards the millennials who value what I hear, laundry service and other things, you know, perhaps I should consider using that as part of the communication about my consumer-directed healthcare plans. You know, we found that 88% of our employees don't think that they need this robust first dollar health coverage, so we are moving to a full replacement strategy, and we're going to offer pet insurance and, you know, laundry service and takeout, you know, whatever those creative benefits are. And I think you have a real opportunity to open the conversation. And I think there also should be, you know, a lot of employers don't like reporting the health coverage on the W-2, but how many of you in the day, you know, I'm showing my age, you know, have sold benefit statements? It's important for people to understand their total compensation, and the access that they have to all of these benefits really contributes to their total compensation. And at the same time, I think as employers, you are going to see employers
especially those that find out their mandated benefits is different than they thought. And those employers who have, as you indicated, Kristen, the majority of their employees would be eligible for subsidies. I think that is an affordability question. I have clients in that small to mid-size, they're still required, but they've been really hit in California with incredible increases, who it is going to be cheaper for them to pay the pay-or-play penalty, both penalties, and their employers are going to get a much better benefit because 76% of them are subsidized. So, you know, we talk about wanting to do the right thing for the employee. There is going to be conversations at some employers about what is the right thing for employees. You know, maybe not today because of the difficulties with healthcare.gov and some of the state exchanges, but maybe in the future that might be a better solution for some group of our employees, and it might be more cost effective for the company, so everyone wins from that perspective.
Cindy, I know you've always been very thoughtful in how you think of the full benefit plan design of all benefits when we're talking about how to enable employers and truly the incentives and the give and take that goes into that from a strategic benefit planning perspective. What recommendations do you have moving into 2020 with regards to that portfolio and the compliance aspects?
Yeah, so I would say one thing that is certain is that for a few years it's going to be uncertain. And as each presidential election comes in, right, that plays a big part in it. I think that benefits are top of mind for more people than it was in the past because they're not so paternalistic. And so what I think really is important to keep in mind is accepting the fact that you have to be flexible and preparing for that flexibility in the benefits that you design, in the technologies and the vendors and the partners that you work with who are watching and also providing solutions that can get you there. I think also, you know, just being very thoughtful in what's happening in the person's individual life, and so just thinking about yourself and what's important to you at those crucial moments, and how you can add value in those moments, which then therefore creates a sense of satisfaction and employees who want to then engage with you on other things like wellness programs or information that you want to deliver to them in the right way. And so I think that's kind of where I see it headed.
Chris?
And I'll offer this. I mean, so if I were a betting man, and I am, the Cadillac tax will be repealed regardless of who wins the White House and what happens in Congress in November. But know that there will likely always be a limitation on the tax preference for employer-sponsored health insurance, which is really why the Cadillac tax was put in the first place. So Republicans and Democrats, regardless of whether you want to argue one way or another that the policymakers should not buy into the economic theory that this tax preference increases healthcare spending, the policymakers have bought into that argument. And as a result, you will see some sort of a limitation come into the law as the Cadillac tax goes out. So you as plan administrators, HR managers, employers, you always have to be looking over your shoulder and know that there will be some sort of limitation which will once again put you back in the place of strategic planning. You can blame it on the policies that come out of Washington, D.C., but really at the end of the day, we all know that you have to engage in that strategic planning anyway, and there really are opportunities to be creative and leverage technology, but that's something I already said. So,
And just one more thought, Stephen.
Yes,
I think another thing to plan for is to have a large group of friends. And so what I mean by that is this idea of creating a community of different types of people who are thinking about the same things. We talked here about you have an opportunity to make a difference. Employers, there are 18,000 employers in the United States. Collectively, you have an opportunity to really have a voice, come together, and participate in those moments with policymakers who are not deep domain experts who need an understanding of why it's so difficult and why it's so important. And so really having access to a community that can be strong, work together towards this is also a very important plan for 2020, I think, or leading up to that.
Okay. Well, Chris and Cindy and Kristen and Jody, thank you so much for your expertise and your willingness to share your insights with us. And thank you for participating in our panel. And I think that brings us to a close. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.